Okay, so today we're just going to go through the solutions to the practice SAC that we recently, that you guys recently did, that was on the school box since last week. Now this is the practice SAC that covered chapters 11, 13 and 14. So just going to run through solutions for this. Now multiple choice, you guys can probably self-mark this yourself. So I'll just kind of scroll through it slowly. So if you want to tick it off as we go, but I will upload this afterwards on the school box. So you can basically mark it yourself once this lesson is over. But those are just the options if you are fast enough to mark them as I'm just scrolling through now. Most of them were pretty straightforward, and you know, some of you who did submit this already to me through email, you did pretty well on multiple choice. I think the multiple choice were not too bad. So yeah, those are just the answers, just scrolling down. Okay, I think there were quite a few multiple choice. I'm just going to keep scrolling down. Oh, wait, got to let a person in, admit. Okay, keep scrolling, keep scrolling. Yeah, so that's basically our multiple choice. Oh my God, how many multiple choice have I put? Okay, good, finally, it's to the end. All right, now we're going to start with section B. So again, you can mark the multiple choice yourself. I will post up this document after the class is over. So starting with question 1 of short answer then. So question 1 is a scenario-based question. And it says, Jackie is completing her first year of university. She's recently been worried about whether she should change to another degree. Her energy levels have been lower and she's finding it difficult to motivate herself to do any study. Jackie's friends have noticed she doesn't want to go out with them as much as she used to. She has decided to continue to go to classes until she decides what to do. Michael is also completing his first year of university. He's not going to his university classes and is very distressed. Instead, he is sleeping a lot during the day and barely eating. He won't see any of his friends and has quit his membership at his local soccer club as well. And the question is, explain why Jackie would be diagnosed with a mental health problem and why Michael would be diagnosed with a mental disorder using examples from the case study. So even if the question doesn't specify to use examples from the case study, you know that it's a given that you have to link back to the case study or link back to the scenario. Okay, so again, this is more of a justify question. We're not asking you to now classify who has the mental health problem, who has the mental disorder. They've given that to you in the question. The idea here is for you to explain, okay, to explain or to justify why is it that Jackie's the one with the mental health problem and why is it that Michael is the one with the mental disorder. Okay, so using the information from the scenario and using your knowledge of the definitions of mental health problem and mental disorder that you've learned. So this is how we might go about it. So I've just written, Jackie would be diagnosed with a mental health problem because her mental state is low and she's experiencing some stress because she's recently been worried. So I've just quoted that from the scenario. Although her motivation is low though, the reason that she's not having a mental disorder is because she's not showing any major dysfunction or impairment. So remember I told you guys, always use the memory tip iPad to determine whether someone is experiencing a mental disorder or not. In Jackie's case, she's experiencing a little bit of stress because she's worried about her university degree and what she should do, but she's not showing any major dysfunction. Okay, for example, she's still continuing to go to classes. Okay, she hasn't given up on university. She's still continuing to go to classes and she hasn't completely switched off in terms of her functioning. On the other hand, so it's not compulsory for you to write a comparing or linking word here, but it's better if you do because it makes your answer flow better. So just a kind of tip there if you want to improve your answer and your flow of your answers. Okay, so a linking word, on the other hand, in contrast, Michael is showing significant personal distress, which is our P of the iPad, personal distress, and has a higher level of impairment and dysfunction. And Michael is showing impairment and dysfunction because number 1, it says he's sleeping a lot during the day. Number 2, he's barely eating. Number 3, he won't see any of his friends at all. And he's quit his membership at his local soccer club. So that's like pretty big blows in terms of his dysfunction or in terms of his impairment. So he's showing a higher level of impairment, and those were the examples I just gave you before. Also, unlike Jackie, he's not going to his university classes, and that's literally just quoted from the scenario here, not going to his university classes. So like I said, or like I always say, you guys can quote information from the case study as long as you're referencing it back to, you know, what you're talking about. So rather than just quoting not going to university classes, you're saying that not going to his university classes is an example of dysfunction. And for that reason, Michael would be having a mental disorder rather than a mental health problem. Okay, so it's just about basically, you know, making sure that you are linking it back to the scenario and linking it back to those examples. You don't even have to list out 4 or 5 examples here. Even if you just said he's got a higher level of dysfunction because he is not going to his university classes and he is refusing to eat, that would have been more than enough. You don't even have to mention the other 2 there, okay? So it's just about knowing how to link back to the scenario, and that would get you 4 marks there, or if you're at something similar to that. Okay, so let's keep moving down. Oh, whoops, I forgot to show you guys the annotations. Okay, yeah, I always forget this part. So anyways, basically everything that I just said must link back to the scenario for full marks. We know that. If you do not link back to the scenario, you will never ever get full marks for a question like this. You don't need to, and this is something that I probably should point out, you don't need to give me definitions of mental health and mental health problem before you get straight into the answer. You don't have to first say, okay, mental health problem refers to blah, 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 mental disorder refers to blah, 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 and then start in the 2 or 3 lines you've got left in that space talking about the scenario. You got to directly link to the scenario. You don't have to provide me definitions of mental health problem and mental disorder because the answer didn't ask you to define those terms in the first place. Okay, so it's all about applying what you know about mental health problem and mental disorder back to the actual scenario that you've got there. Like I said before, it's always good to link back to the characteristics of mental disorder. So using that iPad memory tip that we know, impairment, personal distress, atypical thoughts, feelings, or behavior, or dysfunction. Okay, so those are the 4 kind of key components of people with mental disorders. And using linking words, like I said, can help to improve the flow and improve the general expression of your answer. Okay, so that's basically just some tips there to show you what it is that you need to do to answer a question like this one. Okay, and questions like this are pretty common as well when it comes to this outcome. All right, so moving on to the next question. What does PA stand for? So in iPad, the P stands for personal distress and the A stands for atypical thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So atypical meaning not typical. So for example, for Michael here, an atypical behavior might be not seeing his friends. That's not typical for him as a person. If Michael is someone that loves soccer, quitting his soccer club membership would not be typical. It wouldn't be a behavior that would be typical of him. So that's essentially what we're talking about. Alrighty, question 2. So question 2 is looking at explain why the ethics around the use of placebos should be considered carefully prior to research which involves mental health patients. So again, this is similar to the practice question we did from the chapter 11 practice test, just looking at evaluating the use of placebos here. So in this answer, we're basically just linking up to the ethical implication of how it might affect a mental health patient. So the answer is if a mental health patient participates in research and is placed in the control group, because it's always important for us to acknowledge that people who receive placebos are always belonging to the control group, okay, not the experimental group. Remember, the experimental group receives the actual experimental treatment. They have no use for a placebo in the experimental group. So the control group is the one that always receives the placebo. You have to be very careful to always remember that. Okay, so they have to take a placebo treatment if they're in the control group. And obviously, if you're taking a placebo treatment, you have to stop taking your usual medications. You can't take your usual medications and take a placebo on the side. Why? Because the effect of your usual medications is going to mess up the observation of effect in the placebo. So obviously, you have to not be taking anything else while you take the placebo. Now, as the placebo contains no active drug or no active treatment, it's a fake, it's an inert, it's an inactive substance. This means that the patient is left without their usual treatment for a period of time. And because they're not taking their usual treatment or usual medication, whether it be an antidepressant or a benzodiazepine or whatever it is, their mental health related symptoms are going to become more severe or more intense in the absence of the actual medication for the duration of the time they're taking that placebo. So that's basically all you got to write. So you got 1 mark for acknowledging that if a mental health patient is in an experiment and they put in the control group, they have to take a placebo. and that from stopping the usual medication they take, that is going to lead to their mental health symptoms becoming worse over time. So that's going to be another 1 mark for mentioning that point. So 1 + 1 is a total of 2 marks there. Okay, remember, it doesn't have to be word to word. Like, I always bold the part of the answer that's important. So as long as your answer kind of encapsulates that key idea there that's been bolded, you will get the mark. It doesn't have to be word to word. Of course, the ways that we all express our answers is different. The way that our sentence structure is can be different. As long as the key idea is there, that's what really matters. Okay, moving on to question 3, which is another case study. So it's a kind of big case study. We'll read through it anyway. So Sarah is usually an intelligent, and as I read through this, I'll probably just underline the key things that kind of stick out, okay, in terms of this case study. So Sarah is usually an intelligent, well-educated young woman with a steady job and a beautiful apartment. However, she regularly experiences periods of crippling sadness, anxiety, and self-doubt. She often finds herself thinking that she is hopeless and unworthy of kindness, despite the fact that her friends and family are always there to care for her. In particular, Sarah's dad is very supportive. Whoops, what did I just do? Hold on. Where's my eraser? Okay. Despite the fact that Sarah's dad is very supportive of her, as he has experienced a similar condition. And I should probably mention that. Dad and similar condition. Okay, recently Sarah's boyfriend broke up with her. At around the same time, Sarah's employer asked her to take on difficult duties. This caused Sarah great distress, and she has been feeling nauseous ever since because she's convinced that she will fail. She cannot stop worrying about how embarrassing it will be when she fails. And the next one is, however, Sarah does not want to speak to her employer because she fears that she will get treated differently if she admits that she has a condition. Instead, Sarah visits her doctor to get a prescription. So those are kind of the key ideas or the key things that you should be looking at. And remember, in your actual exam or in your in your actual like VCA exam, and if we were doing this at school, like on paper, normally you would be able to highlight, you are allowed to bring highlighters into the exam. So highlighting these key points that really stick out to you the first time you read a case study is always good practice, because the first time you read something, there are certain things that will kind of pop out as being important to you in terms of evaluating that case study. Okay, anything there which looks like a factor that could influence her mental health. So the first question is identify 2 internal factors and 2 external factors that are contributing to or affecting Sarah's mental stance. Just get rid of all the scribbles here. First thing. Okay, so the 2 internal factors and 2 external factors. Now this question is basically just talking about what are the factors inside of Sarah or internally that are affecting her mental health, and what are the factors surrounding her that are external to her that are affecting her mental health. And remember, the question command term here is identify, which means you just have to list it down in a word or 2. And obviously you have to make sure it's relevant to the scenario, which means that anxiety is something we see Sarah experiences in the scenario. Hallucinations or psychotic thoughts are not an example of something we see in the scenario. So whatever you write here should be reflected or something that you're able to infer from the scenario material given. Okay, so these are some possible answers. You guys got to pick any 2. So if you mention any of these 2, that should be fine. So anxiety is 1, self-doubt is 1, overthinking, low self-confidence. So there's this constant pattern that she's convinced that she'll fail. She's convinced that she can't do her work really well, etc. A lot of worries prevalent in the scenario. Her personal decision that she made to visit the doctor to get a prescription, that is an internal factor as well, because it's related to her decision-making ability, which is a personal or internal factor. Again, external factors, so we're talking about any 2. So we're talking about like supportive friends, Sarah's boyfriend breaking up with her. These are all external. They come from outside the person or outside of Sarah. So with the third factor here that I've mentioned, supportive family or supportive father, the reason that I've mentioned that you should only talk about one or the other but not both is that if you were to write both of these as 2 separate factors, I feel like they're too similar to be considered 2 separate factors, even though they are they are kind of like, they could be considered two separate factors because they are similar, because the supportive father is a part of the supportive family, if that makes sense. I wouldn't really write these as two separate factors, especially because there's so much more external factors within the scenario that we can refer to. Okay, so I would pick either supportive family or supportive factor, supportive father for this one. Sarah having a steady job, her having a beautiful apartment, that might not have actually been something that you even thought was important, but people who have secure housing, who have a place to live, a roof over their heads, they are going to be protected in terms of their mental health. Okay, it's why people with homelessness have so much mental health issues, because they don't have a stable and secure form of housing. So even her beautiful apartment is a big issue here, and it's something that does affect her mental health. Okay, all of these are just examples of external factors. So just pick any two from here, any two from here. If your answer wasn't exactly exactly the same, but was something along the lines, you'd still get the mark, obviously. Again, it really depends on how you phrase that. Okay, so hopefully all of you got 4 marks in total for that one. Okay, so then part B of the question says, drawing on the biopsychosocial model with reference to Sarah's situation, describe one biological, psychological, and social factor that are affecting Sarah's mental state. So now it's just a matter of looking at the scenario, picking one biological factor, one psychological factor, and one social factor. And obviously we would hope that these factors are reflected in Sarah's actual scenario. So you're not going to be talking about her response to some medication when we haven't really been told much about that information. Okay, you wouldn't be talking about Sarah's experience of hallucinations when we haven't seen anything about that in the scenario. So it has to be reflected in the actual scenario. In some cases you can contemplate, okay, especially if the question says something like, rather than saying that are affecting Sarah's mental state, if the question says something like that may affect Sarah's mental state, this then gives you a little bit of room to contemplate and to ponder upon what are the factors that could possibly or potentially affect her mental state. But because the terminologies are here, it's suggesting that you have to talk about the factors that are affecting her mental state in the current scenario. Okay, so one biological factor could be the genetic predisposition. So Sarah is genetically predisposed to anxiety. It looks like that because the scenario says that her dad experienced a similar condition. Again, just quoting from the scenario here. A psychological factor could be Sarah's tendency to overthink and worry excessively. And a social factor could be Sarah's boyfriend breaking up with her, as this relationship breakdown could have worsened some of her symptoms of sadness or anxiety. So you got 1 mark for describing each factor very briefly. And obviously you have to classify that correctly. So if you said, if you talked about genetic predisposition, which is a correct factor, but then you named it as a psychological factor rather than a biological one, you'd only get like half a mark for that, if that makes sense. So the 1 mark isn't just naming the factor itself, but also making sure that factor is correctly classified according to whether it's a biological, psychological, or social factor. Generally expressed factors that are not, even if they are correctly classified, that are not in the actual scenario will not receive marks. So like I said at the beginning, if you talk about a psychological factor being Sarah's experience of hallucinations or delusions, that's not in the scenario. Even though that is a correct psychological factor that could be impacting someone else with a mental disorder, it's not what Sarah's going through. So you have to make sure your whatever you write is usually relevant to the scenario and something that can be reflected clearly in the scenario. Alrighty, so that's a 3-mark question there that's done. And then we've going to the next question, which is an easier one, which is only worth 1 mark. So question 4 is, NASA are recruiting new candidates to be potential astronauts for the next space mission. One of the requirements is that all candidates are in a mentally healthy state. Identify any one characteristic of a mentally healthy person. So these are the characteristics we can talk about. You can talk about high levels of functioning. You can talk about social well-being. You can talk about emotional well-being. You can talk about resilience to life stresses, or even if you simply said the word resilience, that was also accepted in last year's exam. Speaking of last year's exam, they had a similar question to this one. And even if you wrote something like, for example, if you didn't write high levels of functioning, but then you wrote something like the person would have increased participation in extracurricular activities, or they would have increased participation in community initiatives like helping helping the less fortunate. Okay, you would still get a mark for that as per last year's exam and as per the way they marked last year, because it still encapsulates that idea of high levels of functioning. It's just a more specific example. So this is just, I've not given you specific examples like that in this answer, because I want you guys to get used to this idea of understanding that these are keywords. So high levels of functioning, social and emotional well-being, resilience to life stresses, these are keywords that come in the study design. So as important as it is for you to know examples of what social well-being looks like or high levels of functioning looks like, it's also just as important for you to know these keywords themselves. Okay, you can even talk about the absence of personal distress, impairment, or dysfunction. So the opposite of what it is to have a mental disorder. Okay, that would also be accepted then. So that's just a 1 mark question. So as long as you write something along these lines, you got the 1 mark, easy peasy. All right, going to the next question now, question 5. So this is a scenario about phobia. So Sarah is a 5-year-old girl who has a specific phobia of dogs. At her last appointment, her psychologist told her that it is important not to engage in avoidance behaviors, especially if she is to recover or best manage her specific phobia. So part A says, provide an example of an avoidance behavior Sarah might show in relation to her specific phobia of dogs. This is really easy. You just got to give me like any behavior that shows that Sarah is trying to escape or evade or prevent exposure to that stressor there. So I've just written, Sarah might refuse to go to a park if she knows that there are many dogs there. And obviously you have to make sure that this is logical, okay? You can't write Sarah might refuse to go to an aquarium if she knows that there are dogs there, because I don't think people are even allowed to bring dogs into the aquarium. I mean, maybe if it's like one of those, like, I don't know, like the dogs that help people to move around, but I don't know, like generally it's not logical, okay? So you got to make sure that it's relevant. You got to make sure that it is relevant to the actual scenario. Okay, so pet store would be fine. Yeah, so if you write Sarah might refuse to go to a pet store, or you might even say Sarah might refuse to go to a specific shopping center because the pet store is right at the entrance. Okay, so that would be fine. So obviously something where there would logically be a dog present. Okay, so that's what we're looking for. So this is it. Should be an easy 1 mark there, as long as your example actually makes sense. Okay, so that's basically the avoidance behavior. Now, if you just defined avoidance behavior here and you said avoidance behavior is when a person prevents exposure to the phobic stimulus or escapes the phobic stimulus, you wouldn't get a mark because we're looking for a specific example. And when you are looking for a specific example, an example should always read like something that you could see in real life, not like a textbook definition. Okay, so an example is what we were looking for in this scenario, not a definition. Okay, part B of the question. Part B says, briefly describe one example of how Sarah's mother might be able to use psychoeducation, which is a social evidence-based intervention, to model more positive approach behaviors to help Sarah better manage her reactions or responses to, it should say dogs, but I don't know, for some reason I made some typo and wrote spiders there. Anyway, it should have said dogs, okay, in the original one. So anyway, when we're looking at this answer here, it's about, first of all, you have to understand what the question is asking you. So it's asking you about how Sarah's mother, not Sarah herself in this case, Sarah's mother might be able to use psychoeducation to model more positive approach behaviors. Now you have to remember the word approach behavior is something we've already looked at. We've looked at this in chapter 3 when we were talking about stress. Remember, when we're talking about things that stress us out, a phobia being an example of that, or phobic stimulus being an example of something that stresses someone out, we can either approach that, so we can confront our phobic stimulus, or we can show avoidance, which is essentially running away from it. So this question is asking you to give an example of how Sarah's mother might model. What does model mean? That word we saw in observational learning theory. Model is when someone is like a role model, okay? Obviously, Sarah's mother is a role model to her. So how can Sarah's mother use her role model status to an advantage that she can role model more positive approach behaviors for Sarah to better manage her specific phobia? So this is just a sample answer. So through psychoeducation, Sarah's mother could model positive approach behaviors. And the example is what we're really concerned about here. So Sarah's mother might go up to a dog and pat it, or she might hold it in her arms to show Sarah that dogs are not as feral or as dangerous as she thinks. Now, obviously, Sarah's mother has to be a little bit smart about this. You can't just go up to a pit bull and say, oh, what a cute little pit bull, and then hold it in her arms and then her whole face gets mauled off. No, we can't do, you can't do it like that. It has to be something that will be positive approach behavior, where Sarah's mother knows that if she holds a small puppy in her arms, the puppy won't attack her. And as Sarah observes this, or as Sarah watches her mother holding this little puppy or this dog, and the dog's not biting the mother, the dog's not attacking the mother, and everything is kind of calm and cute and relaxing, Sarah might be encouraged to also approach dogs in the future rather than to avoid them, especially because her role model mother has done this and the dogs have not harmed her mother, so why should the dogs harm her? Okay, so it would motivate Sarah to get one step closer to probably confronting and approaching dogs rather than showing avoidance behavior. So that's the answer there. So obviously the example has to be relevant to what a positive approach behavior is. If you talk about Sarah's mother running away every time she sees a dog, that's not what an approach behavior is about. That's an avoidance behavior, and that would have a negative effect. That would not allow Sarah to better manage her response to a dog. So it has to be obviously relevant to the question. And a question like this might seem difficult when you read it at first, but it's just about unpacking and trying to understand what is this question asking me. Okay, so that is part B. Moving on now to the next question, which is question 6, which is also a scenario on specific phobia. So it says, when Hayley was a little girl, she had a negative experience with a clown. As she was walking out of a petting zoo at the local fete, a clown with scary makeup jumped out at her and shouted "boo," which gave her a terrible fright. Hayley was so scared that she started screaming and her parents had to take her home. A similar incident happened again when her older brother decided to play a nasty prank on her by dressing up as a killer clown and chasing her around the backyard. Now, as an adult, Hayley is still distressed by clowns. She never goes to the circus and she avoids most fetes and fairs, as well as the game with the laughing clowns. I always thought that game was a bit weird. Anyway, part A is, using the terminology of classical conditioning, explain how Hayley's experience at the local fete precipitated her phobia of clowns. So remember, we always say the word precipitation or precipitate means develop. So essentially this question is asking us, how did Hayley's experience at the local fete develop or lead to the establishment or development of her specific phobia? So that's essentially what we are talking about. And it's asked us to use the terminology of classical conditioning. Sometimes the question won't be this explicit. It won't specifically ask you to use the terminology of classical conditioning. So you have to remember that whenever you see the word precipitate with reference to specific phobias, you do have to talk about the classical conditioning principles that led to the development of that specific phobia. Okay, and this is a difficult question. So if you found this question hard, it is a downright difficult question. Okay, so don't be stressed or don't feel like, you're not good at this topic. It is a difficult question in general. Okay, so anyway, if we go to scroll all the way down, yeah. Okay, so the first thing you have to do, or the first mark, comes from you mentioning that precipitated means develop. So somewhere at the beginning of your answer, maybe your first sentence, you want to write something like, Hayley's negative experience at the fete precipitated, which means it led to her development of her specific phobia of clowns through classical conditioning. That's already mentioned in the question here. But it's always good whenever you mention development of the specific phobia, mention which theory of learning is involved. It's always classical conditioning. So that's the 1 mark for that first sentence there. The next part is when you talk about the repeated association between the UCS and the NS. Now, all these blue parts, these light blue headings, they're not part of the answer. They're just me trying to clarify what each part of the answer is talking about, if that makes sense. Okay, so you're just focused on the red parts. Anyway, so the second part of your answer now is talking about the repeated association. This is the during conditioning stage. Okay, if we're talking about development of phobias as a 3-phase process, the second part here is the during conditioning. So this is because there was a repeated association between the unconditioned stimulus, which was the clown with the scary makeup jumping out and shouting boo, and a neutral stimulus, which is the sight of the clown in general. You don't have to talk about her brother also wearing scary clown costume and chasing her, but that could be a part of the repeated association as well. Okay, but it's more important for you to talk about the local fate experience, which was when the clown shouted it, jumped out and shouted boo. Okay, so that's the most important thing. So remember, there's a repeated association between the UCS and what is initially the NS, okay, or the neutral stimulus. So repeated association between the clown jumping out at her and screaming boo, and her actually seeing, Hayley actually seeing the sight of the clown, okay, the clown's face. The next part of your answer, and that's 2 marks for that because it is a bit of a explanation you've got to do there. The next part of the question is then talking about how the neutral stimulus will now become the conditioned stimulus. So this repeated association eventually leads to the initial neutral stimulus, which is the side of the clown, or just simply clown, becoming the conditioned stimulus, which is the side of the clowns, or just clown. Okay, so that's 1 mark there. And then the last part is you talking about how now the conditioned stimulus produces the conditioned response. So this ultimately produces the conditioned response in Hayley, so that every time she sees the phobic stimulus, aka the conditioned stimulus, aka the clown, she demonstrates the conditioned response, which is the phobic fear response, which is fear due to the sight of a clown, or due to clowns, okay, depending on how you've worded that. So that would essentially get you the 5 marks there. And it looks like it's a lot, but honestly, if you just understand how phobias are developed in terms of the during conditioning phase of a phobia and the after conditioning phase when the person has actually developed the phobia, that's all you really need to know. Okay, so I know that this is bringing Unit 3 into Unit 4, but remember, in the exam, you can have questions that do mix up information from Unit 3 and Unit 4, and you need to be able to make those links. So in this question, it's very important for you to clearly indicate the key terminology of classical conditioning. So those are your elements. So you've got to use elements like neutral stimulus, conditioned response. Okay, when you talk about the conditioned response, just as we did when we did classical conditioning, you need to mention that. What is it due to? Okay, what's the reason that fear now shows up? So it's important for you to do that. And as always, you have to relate back to the stimulus material. So linking it back to Hayley, using her name, using information from the scenario. So are there any questions about this part A of this question? Because I know this can be a confusing question. Is there anything you want me to any part of this you want me to go through again, or is it kind of like all good? Okay, I'm going to assume it's all good then. Cool. Yeah, if you have any questions about this anyway, you can just always email me as well. So should be all right. Just before we move away from this question, I know we're all sick of seeing this question, but remember that I also mentioned this yesterday. For the context of a question like this, the conditioned stimulus is the phobic stimulus. So in this case, Sarah was scared of clowns. So that will automatically be the phobic stimulus, and that will automatically be the conditioned stimulus in your scenario. Okay, and that's going to basically get one element out of the way for you at least, that you don't have to think about in depth. So the conditioned stimulus is always the phobic stimulus in this kind of a scenario. And the conditioned response is always the conditioned fear response, or the phobia response that is shown by a person who has specific phobia. So that's the actual fear response shown by the specific phobia patient. It's conditioned because it has to be learned. No one is born with a phobia. Phobias are always conditioned or learned kind of disorders or conditions there. All right, so let's keep moving on. Let's see, clear all drawings. All right, the second part of the question is explain how with reference to the scenario, Hayley is maintaining or perpetuating, so perpetuating always means how we maintain a specific phobia, of clowns. Ensure you name the theory or model of learning that is associated with perpetuation of phobias in your response. So there's only one theory of learning that's ever associated with the maintenance of a specific phobia, and that is operant conditioning. So you name that and you got 1 mark already. Okay, specifically Hayley is showing avoidance behavior. Okay, so it says in the scenario, she never goes to the circus and she avoids most fates and fairs. So that's clear example, textbook example of avoidance behavior. And this leads to negative reinforcement. Okay, so that's the 1 mark there. And now the remaining 1 mark for this question comes from you unpacking what does negative reinforcement mean and how is it going to influence her future behavior around her phobic stimulus. So Hayley is removing an unpleasant stimulus, which is clowns, and bringing upon herself feelings of relief and comfort. So by not going to the fair, by not going to the fete, and by avoiding the clown and the circus and anywhere where she'd see a clown, she's getting a lot of relief from that and a lot of comfort. Now, those are positive feelings. So whenever you do something that gives you a positive feeling or remove something that would have made you anxious or scared, it's going to increase the likelihood that the next time Hayley realizes she might see a clown somewhere at some place, she would avoid that situation altogether once again, rather than trying to confront the phobia of clowns. So that's what negative reinforcement is about. And you just simply breaking that down and linking it back to her scenario is what would get you the final mark for this question. So you got 3 marks there, basically talking about those 3 things. Number 1, what's the name of the theory of learning involved? The question specifically asks us to name it, so we got to name it. Number 2, mentioning negative reinforcement, because that's the only thing that's relevant to the maintenance of a specific phobia. And number 3, unpacking what does negative reinforcement mean and linking that back to Hayley's scenario. Okay, so that's essentially where the 3 marks come from. Okay, so now continuing, oh, almost done, cool. Okay, question 7, provide an example of a memory bias that may be demonstrated or reflected by a patient who has a specific phobia of cats. So for this question, it's not just, we're not requiring you to give me the definition of memory bias, but it's more about you understanding what a memory bias is and then applying it to someone who has a specific phobia of cats. So I've just written here, patient who has a specific phobia of cats might show a memory bias such as such as the negative or the threatening events that they, threatening memories they had related to cats. So for example, one time they got bitten by a cat compared to memories that were neutral or less harmful. For example, all the times they walked past a cat without getting attacked or bitten or harmed. So obviously it's important for you to mention, that the memory bias and that specific example there. With the definition of memory bias, you don't have to give the full definition, but the components of those definitions are what are more important here. So talking about the fact that people with memory biases who have specific phobia of cats would remember the positive events, would remember the negative events very quickly compared to the positive events. Okay, I've just written it like a textbook definition here, but it doesn't have to be that complex. Okay, as long as you say something along the lines of memory bias tends to be when you remember the negative events relating to a phobic stimulus more quickly or more easily compared to the positive events. So that's a more simple definition you could have given that would still get you the marks. Okay, so that is basically the 2 marks, or where the 2 marks come from. Now, obviously, if you gave me the memory bias, but it was, for an example, relevant to birds or relevant to dogs or relevant to, I don't know, like magpies or something like that, you wouldn't get the mark for that because the question specifies you to talk about cats. Okay, so just make sure you always read the question properly. And again, whenever we ask you to give an example, it has to be something that we can visualize. Okay, when I say example, the one time they got bitten by a cat, in your head, you're imagining someone getting bitten by a cat. Okay, so examples always have to be descriptive enough that I'm able to visualize that in my head. And that's why we say it should be descriptive and not general or vague. All right, so then we've got question 8, and question 8 is distinguish between tangible and appraisal forms of social support with reference to how they can be protective factors for mental health. So simply just a distinguish or differentiate type question here. So I've just written tangible social support refers to help or assistance in the form of actual resources, and those actual resources could either be materialistic, like money, or could be like personal effort, or like doing chores for somebody who's got anxiety or stress. Appraisal social support refers to having access to someone with whom someone can better interpret or judge a stressor. So remember, appraisal is about how we judge stresses. So essentially that's what appraisal social support is. And sometimes when you tell someone else about your stressor and they're like, oh, you know what, why were you stressing so much? This is only going to contribute 1% to your grade anyway. You're like, oh, okay, I was just stressing for no reason. That's what appraisal social support is. Having someone else there to help you better judge or better determine how stressful is this situation really. Okay, because sometimes we can make things more stressful for ourselves just by overthinking. So having another perspective there is always good. And then obviously you got 1 mark for that correct definition or correct description of tangible, 1 mark for correct description of appraisal social support. And the final mark here is for explaining how can these two be protective factors for mental health. So how can they protect someone's mental health or decrease the chances of the person developing like a mental disorder? So I've just written that in 1 sentence, that both appraisal and tangible social support, any kind of social support in general, is protective for mental health because it can reduce your stress by either providing a person with the resources they need or helping them to better judge a stressful event or situation. So it's almost like repeating what I just said, but just as a kind of like linking it back to how that's a protective factor. Okay, so that's basically the practice SAC solutions booklet done. Yeah, so I'm just going to probably stop the recording here.